going. Thank you very much for coming out to be with us this afternoon. Another fantastic turnout for our second of our four planned Shifley lectures this fall, made possible by the generosity of the class of 1950 in honor of Vice Admiral Shifley. We're really fortunate to have Dr. Scott Mobley with us today. Dr. Mobley, as his introductory slide notes, is a retired Navy captain, class of 1981. He went on to be a surface warfare officer and had major command before he retired and entered the world of academia. He took his doctorate at the University of Wisconsin, and then we were fortunate to get him here in the History Department at the Naval Academy for 2 years as the class of 57 postdoctoral fellow in naval history. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with what a postdoctoral fellowship is, there are basically two goals. It is to give a scholar the opportunity to perfect a manuscript and publish a monograph, and it is to give that scholar the opportunity to land gainful employment in the world of academia, therefore strengthening whatever field it is that postdoctoral fellowship is supporting. And again, through the generosity of the class of 1957, we are continuing to send fantastic naval historians out into the field of academia. I'm pleased to report to everyone that Dr. Mobley was incredibly successful on both counts. You're going to hear about his monograph today, Progressives in Navy Blue, and he is currently the Associate Director of the Center for, I'll get this wrong, Scott, I'm sure, Center for Liberal
Study of Liberal Democracy.
Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy at the University of Wisconsin. So without further ado, Dr. Mobley, thank you.
Well, thanks, Captain Renfro, and I just want to express my gratitude to the Shifley family and the Naval Academy Museum for hosting me today for this talk. Special shout out for Tracy Logan, who helped me figure out how to use this computer. So any issues with audiovisual are my fault, because she trained me well. I see here quite a few friends from the Naval Academy History Department, where they gave me a place to kind of park myself as I went through the process of transforming my dissertation into the book manuscript. And as Captain Renfro described the class of 57 fellowship, postdoctoral fellowship, it really is a wonderful opportunity. We have the current fellow here, Mark Fulsey, and the current class 57 chair, Kathy Broom Williams. And so that's another thanks for the class of 57 for making that possible. I also see here some friends from the Naval Institute Press. There's Glenn back there. Glenn was my editor for this book, so thanks for showing up for my talk. And I want to thank all of you. I mean, this is a great turnout. And it's really exciting for me to be able to talk about the things I've been researching over the last few years, particularly to an audience here at the Naval Academy, where so much of the action that you'll find in my book takes place. So today I want to share with you some highlights on the research behind my book, Progressives in Navy Blue. Here's the book right here. There's some flyers over there, some shameless promotion here. If you're interested, you can just pick one up and I hope and read it. Some of you have read it, so I appreciate that. So the book examines how the U.S. Navy's professional culture transformed at the end of the 19th century. And this transformation is important because it laid the groundwork. This cultural transformation is important because it laid the groundwork for the sweeping changes in technology, organization, and warfighting that we'll see that shaped the U.S. Navy in the 20th century, the American century. I was drawn to this project by my experiences as a naval officer and a scholar. And I wanted to understand better the Navy's professional culture today. So this is about today as much as it is about yesterday, about the past. And this is a culture in which I lived and worked for most of my adult life. So several questions animated my research. First, where did the modern naval culture come from? Second, how was it shaped over time? And third, why is it like it is today? In other words, why do naval officers think and act the way they do? And so I was trying to get to the bottom of this, and guided by these questions, I drew upon threads of research that ultimately landed me in the Gilded Age, specifically the years between 1873 and 1898. There I found a series of fascinating, interrelated developments and trends that form the basis of my talk today. We'll get to some of these developments soon enough, but first I'd like to make an introduction. And here he is. This is Mobley D. Evans, U.S. Navy. You'll see there at the left is a picture of Midshipman Evans at the beginning of his naval career, and at the right we see Rear Admiral Fighting Bob at the end of his, towards the end of his naval career. So Mr. Evans matriculated to the Naval Academy in 1860. This is a tale of timing, how timing is everything. Within a year of his, during his plebe year, his home state of Virginia up and seceded from the Union. This left young Mobley, young Bob, in a rather interesting situation because he had to choose where his loyalties lied. His family beckoned him home to Virginia. But after some soul searching, the 14-year-old midshipman, he was 14 at the time, they were younger back then, he decided to stay with the Union. So he was one of the, actually quite a few Southern-born officers that stayed north. To the right, you see, again, Rear Admiral Fighting Bob Evans. And he would go in, I guess that was a good call for him because he would go on in his naval career, which spanned into the 20th century, to achieve national and international fame by helping to shape America's place in the world. So Evans is our protagonist for today. His naval career spans the timeline of my study. His personal transformation from mariner warrior, you see in the bottom underneath the picture there, mariner warrior to warrior engineer illustrates the dramatic culture shift experienced by the naval profession during the closing decades of the 19th century. So as I mentioned, Evans was a 1864 graduate of the Naval Academy. There in the 1860s, he and his classmates principally trained in mariner skills. That's mariner warrior, this is the mariner part. Seamanship, navigation, ship handling, in the age of sail. I mean, this is all about, as the middle picture shows, he would have been up on the mast, furling and unfurling sails, and then eventually directing other sailors in doing those types of things. In addition to mariner skills, warrior skills were also emphasized. And by this I mean tactical skills, things like gunnery, ship handling in combat, and yes, infantry tactics. Because back then these young officers were expected to be able to lead landing parties and boarding parties. So that called for a completely different skill set that we don't see at the Naval Academy today, except there is a legacy in the beloved P-raids that happen every fall and spring. I guess that's the last little piece of infantry maneuvers. So naval professionals held these skills, the mariner skills and the warrior skills, in highest regard. And Evans recorded this fact in his memoir. So here's what he says in his memoir. English studies occupied a considerable part of our time. I don't see anyone from the English department here. So English studies occupied a considerable part of our time, but practical seamanship and gunnery were considered the important things, and they were hammered into us hard. So as the captions in the images on the slides indicate here, Evans had ample opportunity to demonstrate his prowess as a mariner warrior, including the landing party bit of it. And you can see here in this lower image, he's not in the picture, but it depicts an event that he took part in, storming of Fort Fisher, North Carolina, near Wilmington, towards the end of the Civil War. He was wounded in that action multiple times. So he certainly proved his mettle as a mariner warrior. So let's fast forward a few decades and look at what he became over the course of his career. By 1900, complex mechanical and electrical systems had come to comprise the modern warship. And comprehensive strategic plans guided the employment and movement of modern fleets. In this new environment, Evans and his contemporaries had become warrior engineers. Evans's personal transformation took him to Appleton, Wisconsin, of all places, where on leave of absence from the Navy, he constructed a state-of-the-art wood pulping mill. He worked in, let me click this. There we go. He worked in Appleton with this gentleman here on the left named Frederick Winslow Taylor. Has anybody ever heard of Taylorism? Yeah, so he's pretty well known, at least compared to other people, because he is really the father of modern industrial engineering. Think Henry Ford and the assembly lines, that came a little later. That all came from Taylor's ideas. So here he is in 1890 working with this young naval officer to develop a state-of-the-art industrial plant. And so, as you can imagine, Evans was able to absorb some of these innovative ideas, these progressive ideas that Winslow was beginning to articulate at this time. So that's pretty significant. That we have the Navy working, and he wasn't the only one. There's another officer in Maine doing the same thing with the same type of mill. So this experience in Wisconsin had a powerful impression on Evans. And here's what he says about it from his memoir. I was directed to erect a sulfite fiber mill at Appleton, Wisconsin, which I did, and in 9 months had it completed and turning out first-class sheets of wood fiber. When all the water wheels were running and the vast mass of machinery doing its work, I felt well repaid for my labor. And then he says this, the knowledge I gained was of great benefit to me afterward when I found myself in command of a ship with her 70-odd engines of various kinds. So this moment in Appleton, Wisconsin, actually kind of marks Evans's conversion from a mariner to an engineer. Now it's all about machines, about motors, it's about steel and steam. And in fact, he would go on from this assignment to assume command of the new steel cruiser Yorktown, and later he commanded 2 modern battleships, the Indiana and the Iowa. On the Iowa, he was in command of the Iowa at the Battle of Santiago de Cuba in 1898. So Evans's warfighting expertise also expanded while his mechanical expertise did at the same time. He expanded he transformed from a tactician to a strategist during these years of the 1880s and 1890s. During the 1890s, he expressed strong support for the Strategic Studies program at the nascent Naval War College. Later, he attended that school. In 1900, the Secretary of the Navy assigned Captain Evans as a member of the newly created General Board, the Navy's first permanent strategy-making body. Finally, in 1908, as depicted here on the bottom image, Evans commanded the Great White Fleet on the first leg of its globe encircling mission. And I would say that mission is as strategically and politically significant as they come. So here we have the warrior engineer. Now I'd like to step back and look at the backstory behind the metamorphosis of Evans and his generation from mariner warrior to warrior engineer. 2 revolutions drove this shift in culture and identity. One in technology, the other in strategy. It didn't work. Okay, let me back up for a minute. All right. This image was supposed to fade in, but that's okay.
So much for technology.
Yeah, so much for technology. So during the final decades of the 19th century, advancing industrial technology radically altered the composition of navies worldwide. Powerful mechanized warships replaced their age of sail antecedents. And by way of example, and I offer this as a way to kind of convey to you the impact of these changes. Here we have the USS Trenton, which was launched in 1876. This was state of the art for the US Navy in the 1870s. When you look at it, compare it to this image, which is supposedly of Francis Drake's Golden Hind era of during the Spanish Armada era, 300 years before, fundamentally, there's not that much different. Both hulls are made of wood. Sail power is the primary source of propulsion. Both have broadside batteries of cannons to do battle. Now, there is a big difference here. You see the smokestack. There's a steam engine there, but even in the 1870s, for the most part, steam was considered an auxiliary form of propulsion, which was a good thing because the engines broke down an awful lot anyway. And so sail was still considered we still need to have these mariner skills to sail these ships because we're not using steam that much. So let's fast forward to this image, hiding underneath the software changes I required. This is the USS New York. It was launched in 1891, part of one of the first generation of modern steel warships. See if this works. If the Trenton here was looking backwards, the New York is looking forwards. We see features in the New York that still exist or that are present in USS Zumwalt. For one thing, it's a steel hull, metal hull construction. We have a bridge here to control the ship's maneuvers. The bridge there. Guns no longer in broad. Well, we do have some casement weapons here, but the primary batteries are, you can't see it, this one's hiding, are turrets. And these are modern turrets. And you can see here, it's also, where's the sail, any sailing rig on the New York here? No, there's not. Any on the Zumwalt? No, there's not. And you can see here we have triple funnels because we have a lot more horsepower down inside the ship to push it through the water. The funnels in the Zumwalt are hidden in the superstructure. You get the idea. So these changes in naval materiel are hugely important. And they're very dramatic when you see them in these types of images. And it happened, remember the difference between this ship and this ship was 15 years, less than a generation. So that has a pretty profound impact. We think about how technology is advancing today. Imagine what it was like back then to see, in many ways, this was more profound than anything we're seeing right now, in many ways. So these dramatic changes in naval material were hugely important, but as historian John Kuhn points out, often the technology piece gets first billing. And that's true here. Technology is only part of the story of cultural transformation within the US Navy Officer Corps at the end of the 19th century. There's another piece of this that I'd like to discuss now, and that is what I call the Strategical Revolution. Now, my thesis advisors went round and round on me on this word strategical. They say it doesn't exist. And they want me to put strategic, but I won that battle. It does exist. You know what strategical means? Strategic. But it sounds nicer, and it goes better with technological. So in the United States, a revolution in strategic thought and practice accompanied these technological advances during the Gilded Age. Prior to the 1880s, the Navy did not appreciate strategy as a professional skill set. Most officers believed only tactical knowledge and skills were sufficient to do their jobs well. Strategy making and strategy thinking were neither valued nor practiced during peacetime. And during wartime, naval strategy was an improvised ad hoc affair, as demonstrated by the blockade board of the Civil War, which existed for all of 3 or 4 months at the beginning of the war, after which it was disbanded. So there was no formal strategy-making body in the US Navy during the Civil War. There were other things they were doing, but that wasn't one of them. So up until now, it was all about tactics. It's all about things like gunnery and infantry maneuvers and things like that. However, this narrow warfighting mindset began to change during the post-war years, post-Civil War years, with a surge of interest in strategic matters, animating the U.S. Navy Officer Corps during the 1870s and 1880s. Concerns over technology, national security, Civil War experiences, and professional angst drove this strategical revolution. New professional forums like the Naval Institute Proceedings helped to disseminate strategical ideas to a wider professional audience. Strategic studies, strategic planning, and strategic institutions such as the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Naval War College appeared on the scene there in the 1880s. Within this context, the famous works of Alfred Thayer Mahan helped to focus and amplify strategic interest within the U.S. and other navies. But Mahan was part of a much wider trend. By the mid-1890s, a new strategical ethos emerged within the U.S. Navy, one that valued naval warfare expertise and stressed strategic ability as necessary for high command. And it was during this period we began to see the first formal efforts at strategic planning, of which this image is part of. This was a Naval War College exercise, planning exercise, that depicted a British attack on the Northeast United States. So the red are the Brits and the blue are the US. And so this type of general strategic plan did not exist a decade before. This was new, and this was really revolutionary in many ways. So naval commanders like Evans now focused on fleet operations and campaign planning. Strategic knowledge and skills supplanted tactics and gunnery as the crowning professional competencies. So more backstory. So while this is going on, these technological changes and the what I call the strategical revolution, we're also seeing a profound shift in the primary role and mission of the U.S. Navy, and it's depicted by these images. To your right, you see what I call, and at the time, the naval officers call it, the Peace Navy. And for most of the 19th century, the U.S. Navy existed to promote and protect U.S. trade abroad, not to fight wars. In fact, 90 years of the 100 of the 19th century, that was the U.S. Navy's primary mission. 10 years, if you add up all the years of actual war, the U.S. experience, and I'm not talking about interventions, I'm talking about big wars, it comes to about 10 years. So this was really a force that was structured by commercial needs, not defense policy. So these commercial needs define the Navy's primary role, a circumstance that helps to explain why these naval officers were so interested in things like gunnery and landing parties, because those were the types of operations they expected to take part in, expected to lead in this commercial, I call it it's like an informal commercial empire. And in fact, if you read the literature of the time, they think of this worldwide commerce and the expansion of this as an imperial project. So in fact, the Navy was, in many respects, an imperial navy. But that changes in the 1880s. And what happens is that growing national security concerns during the 1880s prompted U.S. policymakers to rethink the Navy's mission. And the year 1886 marks the moment when U.S. anxieties over international politics and advancing technology overseas surpass the concerns for promoting and protecting a maritime empire. In February of that year, Secretary of the Navy William C. Whitney proposed building a new war navy comprised of modern warships designed principally to confront the heavy squadrons of other maritime powers rather than police imperial affairs. And in his words, Whitney asked Congress to fund, and I quote, a real navy, ironclads and torpedo boats and cruisers and all that to replace our old wooden ships. Whitney intended this new fleet to operate defensively during wartime within the Western Hemisphere. Indeed, the first steel battleships constructed by the United States, Texas, Maine, the Indiana classes, would possess insufficient steaming range to cross the Atlantic or Pacific and immediately engage in combat. coupled with the Navy's new strategic consciousness, this emerging war fleet superseded the Navy's traditional role as an imperial constabulary force. And although U.S. warships would continue to promote and protect the nation's expanding commerce, commercial interests abroad, these activities no longer comprise the Navy's principal raison d'etre. In response, naval leaders reconfigured the U.S. fleet as an instrument of hemispheric defense and designed contingency plans to defend the hemispheric perimeter, not to extend the nation's imperial reach, as some historians have argued. We can talk about that more in the Q&A if you want. But moving on. So within the Navy, we talked, the book's called Progressives of Navy Blue, right? So let's talk about Progressives of Navy Blue. So the officer corps designed to lead this new war battle fleet, men like Mobley Evans embraced a progressive ideology. Like their civilian counterparts, naval innovators saw science, technology, and expertise as the paths to transformation. They advocated the use of specialists and professional experts, scientific method, collaborative problem solving, and an ethos of efficiency and continuous improvement. The body of progressive bureaucratic thought propounded by social historian Robert Wiebe, for those of you who know Wiebe's work. Naval adaptation of the bureaucratic approach demonstrated what I call lower P progressivism, a singular approach to reform in politics, education, social programs, and other fields like warfighting, in contrast to the big capital P progressive movement that emerged in the early 20th century and continues to the present day, especially in the part of Wisconsin that I live in. Indeed, the attitudes and methods of naval innovators anticipated the wider surge of progressive era development in the United States by some 10 to 20 years, reflecting the Navy's emergence as an innovative, adaptive, problem-solving culture. So within that culture of progress, we have actually two schools of thought emerge, what I call two cultures of progress, strategy and mechanism. And these align pretty well with this warrior engineer idea that I talked about at the beginning. So mechanism was an outlook that valued expertise in theory, operation, construction, and management of industrial technology. So we're talking about building and operating ships and ship systems. Obviously, the people who adhere to this mechanism idea gave great value to what we now call STEM education: science, technology, engineering, and math. On the other hand, we had this other school of thought, which I call strategy. And the strategists advocated expertise in all levels of naval warfare, including tactics, operational level, strategical. They're looking at how to use ships and systems to achieve specific objectives as set forth by the National Command Authority. Obviously, this group also valued history in addition to STEM education. Now, it's interesting because these two groups shared progressive pedigrees. Everything I said about experts and scientific method and collaborative problem solving, they both bought into that. So we have two progressive cultures rising within the Navy, and some people were all about mechanism, some were all about strategy. Many officers fell in between. Mobley Evans was an in-between kind of guy. He had credentials on the mechanism side and on the strategy side. But as typically things happen within the Navy, there was conflict between these two groups. I call it culture conflict. And what happened is that we had people that had these competing visions for the future of the Navy, and there's only finite resources out there, coming from Congress in terms of budget. And so they got involved in resource battles, both in terms of money, in terms of real estate, actual facilities, and in terms of basically who would control the future of the Navy. So that brings us to the next slide. So needless to say, this path was not smooth. And a new professional consensus would arise in time, but not before the naval culture wars of 1885, 1893. So here we have the schools of mechanism, the schools of strategy, actually clashing with each other. And the fault line ran right through Newport, Rhode Island. So the Naval War College, which was established in 1884, becomes kind of the battleground for these two groups kind of fighting it out. Here on the left, we have a very prominent mechanist, Ramsey, and our famous Alfred Thayer Mahan, so I did get to Mahan, BJ, represents the strategic side. And so what happens in the late 1880s, Ramsey is actually superintendent here at the Naval Academy, but he has a very, and these other guys down here, I just put this down, there are other players in this struggle on both sides. And so I put them down, their images and their names. You can see what they are. I'm not going to really talk about them today, unless you want it in the Q&A, but all of these people played a role. And you notice there, we have both civilians and uniformed officers, secretaries of the Navy. So this was very much a civil-military battle. So what happens is that Ramsey has his allies in Congress and in the Navy Department, and he doesn't like the idea of the War College. He doesn't think it's necessary. And the reason that is that he really wants to place all of our resources on developing technology and learning how to manage and operate that technology. He was a very accomplished mechanist, as I like to say. And so Mahan at the time was the president of the Naval War College in the late 1880s. And Ramsey works with his political allies, including the Secretary of the Navy. And basically, by 1888, Mahan is sent packing. And he's banished. He's removed as president of the War College, which had only been in existence for 4 years, only 3 years worth of classes at this point. And he is sent to Puget Sound, the Puget Sound area to basically identify a site for a Navy base. So anyone who's ever been to Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, that's all about Mahan. That was his. So he's off, he writes letters to his mentor, Stephen Luce, who was really, the War College was his brainchild, and he's lamenting the end of the War College. And so he is removed. The War College goes from its site on Coasters Harbor Island to Goat Island, where the torpedo school is. There's another Navy school that's more technical in nature. And the people who support the school see this as the end of the institution. It's going to go away. And maybe it would, except for one fortuitous moment. This guy, Casper Goodrich, is the commander of the torpedo school. It just so happened he was on the board that was appointed by the Secretary of the Navy in 1884 to study whether or not we should have a war college. So he was one of the people that recommended we establish the war college. So he considered it for the rest of his life kind of his crowning moment is that even though he was given the war college to let it with the expectation of wither on the vine, he kept it going and he saved it. And a change of administration, with a change of administration, they were able to resurrect the War College and actually start building a new building and put Mahan back in charge. Fast forward to 1893, it almost new change of administration. Ramsey is now head of the powerful Bureau of Navigation, which is kind of like BUPERS now, but a super BUPERS. It was like he's like the senior bureau chief in the Navy, and he has within his power to do in the Naval War College, and he tries to do it again. And he had this guy here, Hillary Herbert, was the Secretary of the Navy, one of his allies, one of Ramsey's allies, part of the cable that kind of gave the War College a rough time back in the 1880s. There's this famous story, which I'm pretty sure is mostly true. There's a couple different sources. He goes up to the Naval War College in his the secretary's yacht, basically, and with an intention to shut it down. And actually, he actually admits this in a letter later on. And he's going to go shut it down, and the CEO of the ship hands him a copy of Mahan's latest book, which he reads with great interest. And and when he gets to Newport, it just becomes an inspection tour. And he comes back and writes Mahan a letter saying, yeah, we really kind of screwed you over before, but I just want to tell you, the War College is safe. It's doing great work. So with that, we see kind of this ascendancy we see the Naval War College and the strategic ethos kind of getting some roots in official cover, and then we go on from there. So by the end of the period, around 1898, what we're seeing is that strategy has come to dominate the scene, but mechanism remains a potent force. And so there's continuing cultural tension between the two. And into the first decades of the 20th century, we see kind of a consensus develop where the new naval officer, the modern naval officer, becomes this hybrid where he's thinking both strategically and mechanically. We tend to call them, the terminology at the time was generalists, but they had skills in both realms. I like to think STEMs and humanity is one way to look at it. And that's the model of naval officer that carried us through into, with various changes and perturbations, carried us through into past World War II. So, but what's interesting is this cultural tension between what I call the strategic side and the mechanical side continues to the present day. We have a dichotomous identity as naval officers today, warrior-engineer. Sometimes, though, it's engineer-warrior. You can ask Admiral Rickover about that. So that kind of got to the heart of my study, which is why do we think and act the way we do today? And there you have it. That's the backstory. So Evans goes on and does great things. And with that, Mark.
About Fighting Bob.
Yeah.
You say he goes on to do great things.
Sort of.
One of the things he does is he's one of the naval officers, I believe it's the mid-1890s. And this happens again in the first decade of the 20th century under Teddy Roosevelt's administration, trying to kick Marines off the ships. Okay? So this battle that you're talking about with the...
Well, I thought the Marines didn't want to be on the ships. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, they didn't. It's weird. Within the Marine Corps itself, they're having their own kind of disagreements about what the Marine Corps is supposed to be doing during this period of time. But anyway, my question to you is, and I didn't know all that was going on with the Naval War College. I thought that was fascinating, but it kind of reminded me. So there's that fight in the Naval War about the Naval War College, but right around the same time, they're publishing articles in proceedings about getting Marines off the ships, and they're saying some pretty inflammatory things about Marines. They're lazy. They're bad for discipline. They just take up space on the ships. We need to get them off. These ships are very much much more technical and technologically driven and all that kind of stuff. So they don't. So what does that play? What does that part of the story? How does that play into your narrative here?
Right. Well, one thing, the Marines were much more closely integrated in the Navy at this time, and like you'll see Marine officers at the Naval War College, and so which is kind of why are they doing that? But they do, and so when I use the word, that's why I like to use the word naval more than Navy, because the Marines were kind of lockstep in this. At the same time, there's just these questions going out about the Marines' mission. Why do we have them on ships? This is playing out in the background, and I think kind of the Marines kind of go off on their own little tangent, and Marco's looked at this, where they're developing, they're buying the Kool-Aid on the strategy stuff, and so they're starting to figure out how do we develop, what kind of strategies can we, carry out and develop and carry out. What special roles do we have in this bigger trend of strategizing?
Yeah, and there's that, but they also don't want to get kicked off the ships because they see that as
well. Part of it's there's ambivalence because the future hasn't come yet, and there are people who think that they need to stay relevant, and that's by doing that you maintain the status quo. So just like within the Navy, there's different schools of thought. In the Marine Corps, there's different schools of thought too. So I think that was part of it. I think there's other things too. I'm not a Marine Corps scholar, so I don't know, but I think part of it is that we keep what we have until whatever the future is kind of unfolds. Yes, sir.
The Last Shipmate, I don't know if anybody has read their Last Shipmate, there's a great history article in there. And part of it talks about going into the 20th century, but one of the things it talks about was the impact of the Spanish-American War and on the Navy battle experience carrying forward with those guys. And I know that's probably a whole new subject here, but I wondered if, in a very small amount of information, could you share a little bit on, did that impact a lot of what was going on?
Sure, and well, we didn't know the Spanish-American War was going to happen. There were people who wanted to go to war with Spain, and eventually we did, but it wasn't guaranteed. But during the 1890s, with this strategic ethos starting to gain momentum in the Navy, naval officers started to do contingency planning. I showed you an image of a contingency plan in case the British were to attack, but there are also plans and a lot of debate over these plans on what happens if we go to war with Spain, particularly with Cuba. And it's a fascinating history. There was an article, did Michael Crawford, there's a couple articles out there about this, and the book actually steps through it as well, the book. Steps through it as well. And basically, so there's all these debates about what's the best strategy. So what this means is that when the war breaks out, kind of unexpectedly in 1898, the Navy's got plans on the shelves. And so they basically, then they form, the Secretary of the Navy forms a strategy board that has these plans available, and they kind of cobble together the actual strategy of the war. And the Navy has a fair amount of success. Army less so. Army didn't quite have that planning ethos yet. And what we see coming out of the War of 1898 for the Army is what are called the root reforms, the creation of the Army War College. A lot of that's driven by the mistakes of the war. The Navy, on the other hand, kind of gets a pat on the back, gets a ton of money to rebuild the Naval Academy, and develop more ships and a bigger Navy. Plus, now we really have an empire that we have to manage, so we need to get a Navy that will do that. But the success of those plans before the war kind of gave some momentum to provide more structure in that way. And in 1900, Secretary of Navy Long forms what's called the General Board, which among other things was, like I said earlier, the Navy's first permanent strategic planning organization, with that mandate. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So could you, when you were researching this, as far as the having this dual mindset of engineer and warrior, what is it about the American history, or what played into that changed sort of our role, where we as officers sort of have to have both? Whereas when we go work with other European powers, and we've always got, like the British Navy, for instance, they have separate tracks.
Right.
Engineering officers, and then they have officers that only do tactics.
That's a good question, because what I didn't talk about is during the period here during these years, the Navy has dual track. They have engineers, a separate career path from the line officers. And particularly during the 1870s, there was a lot of bitter fighting between the two corps, which I talk about a little bit in the book. But what happens is that before the Spanish-American War breaks out, the Navy forms a committee chaired by Teddy Roosevelt, Under Secretary of the Navy, to figure out what to do about this. And they decide what we need to do is amalgamate the Line Corps and the Engineer Corps. So in the Navy Act of 1899, they do that. So right after the war, they carry through with that plan. And so now we don't have engineers separate from line officers. It's all the same. And it's interesting because all these people with like chief engineer so-and-so or assistant, all of a sudden now you're a commander, now you're a lieutenant, they get actual line rank. And so the distinction is gone. So it's interesting, given current events and some of the initiatives that are being talked about, that we're looking at separating that out again. So I think it'd be really helpful to look at that history, look at the reasons why they wanted to separate or wanted to amalgamate before we pull them apart again. It's interesting, naval officers themselves, there were factions within the Navy that were all behind this amalgamation idea, and there are other factions that didn't want it. And I think it took Teddy Roosevelt to actually say, this is what we're going to do. But I've seen, if you look at Naval Institute debates in the Naval Institute, they're talking about this in the 1870s. The idea of amalgamating, why don't we just be all one thing? So the idea kind of percolates all through these decades, and then it finally comes to fruition at the end of the century. Yes, ma'am.
And so at the beginning of the 20th century, everybody was a line officer. When
Yeah.
did they bring on the staff?
Well, the staff always existed, and actually the engineer corps was staff. We had like a paymaster corps, chaplains and doctors were staff corps, and so those go way back into the, and actually like paymasters and doctors go back to the Continental Navy even, and because it's a British model and we're following that. They kind of formed this staff identity, you know, during the antebellum years. I mean, BJ.
Yeah, it's approaching the Civil War that they start to consider. Prior to that, they're warrant officers. Surgeons are technically warrant officers, right? The doctors are the staff corps. Same with pursers who become paymasters. Is that they're technically equivalents of warrant officers, but it's approaching the Civil War that the staff corps identity that we know today begins to form.
So, and actually the nurse corps is around World War I time, just before World War I think. It's when the nurse corps was established.
So Dr. Mobley, can you take perhaps one more question?
I have a suggestion to make your use of the word strategic even more jargony. Instead of just, so you took the right step in making it jargony with making it strategical. So in the future,
I
if you
love
want to,
strategical.
if you really want to come across as jargony and hip, you can use a word like strategicalities.
I'll keep that in mind.
Think about it. Yeah, that's progressive. That's progressive.
All right.
So, real quick, did Mahan, after Puget Sound, ever reemerge back?
Yeah, he ended up going back. Well, a lot of this has to do with domestic politics. New administration comes in. They managed to get through to, well, among other things, they're thinking that the Secretary of the Navy actually read a draft of Mahan's book, Influence of Sea Power, his first one. But anyway, they come back in favor. He's brought back to Newport and put in charge of the War College again. They don't have classes for a couple years, partly because they're building a new building, but partly because Ramsey is trying to mess things up so he doesn't make officers available to go to the War College. So, yeah.
So he has,
Right.
reemerge, yeah.
All right.
All right, well, I always promise with these things that we'll get everybody to fifth period, so it is that time. Dr. Mobley, thanks for a great talk.
Thank you.